Great. Well, as it's 12:31, let me make a start so I can pass you on to the wonderful guest speakers we have here today with us, Nadine and Kirsty, who are going to share about this new global food crisis that has really become very high on our radar in terms of thinking about the issues that are most impacting the world's poor and vulnerable right now. And as you know, Micah doesn't just think about the issues, we offer ways to practically engage and to advocate about how we, in our churches, as individuals, and in our nation, can respond to these global challenges. So that's what we'll be doing today, sharing a bit about this issue and sharing a bit about how we are responding through the new Help Fight Famine campaign and how you can use that in your churches. For those of you who are coming to Canberra with us at the start of September, you'll be staying on the line and we'll be talking a little bit more about the practical steps required for that trip as we prepare for that too. But just by way of introduction, my name is Matt Darvas and I'm the National Director at Micah Australia. And I'm joined by the wonderful Carly, who is done a wonderful job over the last 12 months stepping in for Beck Wilesmith, who's our senior advisor and coordinates this Women Leaders Network, who's been on maternity leave, and Beck comes back in October. So we're very grateful for the role that Carly has played in that time. And many of you know Beck, and she's had her son who's very healthy, and she's looking back to coming back part-time and engaging with you all too. So as I begin, could I just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all gathered and meeting from today, right across this land's now called Australia. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we welcome any First Nations leaders that are here on the call with us today. So as I just begin, we'd like to share a video with you unpacking the global food crisis. And then I'm going to throw to Kirsty and Nadine to share a little bit more. And then Carly, I think I'll share about the campaign and what people can do at the end of those presentations by our guests, if that's okay. So if you can play the video, we'll move forward from there.
Imagine if there was no food left. Well, for Kengan, this is her reality.
My 2-week-old baby cannot stop crying due to hunger. I was 8 months pregnant when a man from neighboring community attacked our village.
Managing to escape with her life, there was no food to be found anywhere. Unable to produce enough milk with no food source and now no home, Kengan wanders from farm to farm in a desperate attempt to feed her 2-week-old daughter. She is one of 49 million people on the brink of famine. This is a crisis of 2022 proportions. COVID-19, the climate crisis and global conflict are breeding new levels of hunger. You've seen how the war in Ukraine has affected food prices in Australia. But in countries where people were already struggling to find food, this conflict has pushed them to the breaking point. We can save millions of lives if we choose to act now. Our government has shown their desire to stand with nations tackling the worst of this crisis. Now we are calling on them to action a famine prevention package of $150 million to help save lives in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and countries in Africa where food shortages threaten millions. Australia, we can make a difference right now. Write to your MP today. Help fight famine.
Thanks, Carly. Well, I'm going to pass now to Nadine, who is at World Vision as an advisor on fragility and conflict zones, who has been working on this issue for a number of years and tracking its progression, and actually has come up with a lot of the policy and the asks which we are taking to government right now. So Nadine, I'd like to pass to you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here and speak to you. I feel like after this beautiful powerful video. I don't actually need to give my my spiel on where we got here, but I'll go through it. I just wanted to kind of reiterate some of the magnitude of the scale and how we got here. What were the main contributors or drivers of this global hunger crisis? Today, over 828 million people will go to bed hungry. And if we take a step back, in 2005, the world decided to say enough is enough. We want a fairer world. And they said, no more, like we're working towards zero hunger. And in 10 years, in 2015, the number of hungry people have dropped from 805 million to 590 million people. Now, that's a great progress. It's still a lot of hungry people, but it is massively a massive improvement. However, in the last 2 years, just the last 2 years, that progress was completely obliterated. In the last 2 years, an additional 238 million newly hungry people have been recorded. Now, this is really an alarming figure, but what is even more scary is the 49 or now actually 50 million people that are already at the brink of starvation. Now, how did we get these? These are really really large numbers to comprehend. I think the first and most driver of hunger is the protracted conflicts. There's so many protracted conflicts going across different parts of Africa, Middle East, Asia, and the conflict is both a cause and an effect to hunger. The second biggest driver is the climate emergency. Now, the UN has estimated 1.3 billion people are facing extreme weather, heat waves, and climate-related disasters. But the climate change threat poses a bigger risk on the hungriest people in the world. And it's often not a sudden shock. It's a long, sustained droughts that last for years, extreme temperatures and irregular rainfall. Now, we see this most in countries across Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Now, this region is called the Horn of Africa. Now, if I can give an example of how it is like in the Horn of Africa, the Horn has 2 rainy seasons. Now, this is the time usually, farmers sow their seeds and herders, fatten their cattle. In known recorded history, and I think it extends back to 100 years ago, the Horn of Africa have faced 3 consecutive rainfall failure. 3 consecutive droughts. Now, in this day and age, the Horn of Africa is facing its 4th drought. And our best prediction says that the next rainy season will come with very little rain, forcing the region to go through a 5th consecutive drought. Now, to this day, 7 million cattle have already died. There's simply not enough water to quench their thirst or enough grass to feed them or sustain them. Now, if you take all of this and put on top of it the impact of COVID-19 and the socioeconomic fallout of this pandemic, now we have seen incomes being disrupted, supply chains disrupted. There's increased inequalities, especially across the world, gender, all of that came into play. But what we've also seen is increased public debts and weakened currencies. Now, these weakened currencies is what is used to buy fertilizers, food, and fuel. And we have all seen and felt the impact of spiraling prices. Now, the latest accelerant to the global food crisis is the war on Ukraine. Now, the war in Ukraine is not only impacting the people of Ukraine, it's actually being waged against the world's hungriest people. Here in Australia, we have felt quite painfully the increase in fuel prices. But what that means in a place like Horn of Africa is that a farmer now who needs fertilizer to grow the harvest is forced to purchase less fertilizer, which means that they are forced decrease the harvest. Now, the prediction is that because of the spiraling prices for food and fertilizer, all of that, the actual harvest will drop even by 20%. Now, the war in Ukraine, we've all probably heard in the news that the Ukraine wheat is now off market because of the blockage. Now, Ukraine wheat actually is responsible for feeding 30% of the world's hungriest people, and now that is gone. There's lots of efforts to try to put that, to try to get them out ports from the Ukraine, but not enough. Now, children, they are the least prepared to deal with this lack of food, and they're suffering really a great deal of pain. Millions in the Horn of Africa, over 1,300 children have already succumbed to death. Millions are at what we call an emergency level of hunger. And this is where a child is so severely malnourished that their body starts to consume themselves on whatever little energy is left within their bodies. The internal organs, they start to shut down, and their bodies is ravaged with diseases. Now, they're often, even if they have food or they're offered food, they're often too weak to eat it. But that's not the worst of it. The UNICEF predicts that there's 8 million children that are already suffering from wasting. Now, wasting is a technical terminology, but it is the most lethal form of severe malnutrition. And to compound the issue is that only 1 in 4 children now have access to life-saving intervention, which includes food, water, air, therapeutic feeding programs. The UN is warning that there will be multiple famine declared in this year, and they're warning that 2023 will probably even be worse. So the question that we have today, and the question that brings you all here today, is we are today staring in this monstrous global food crisis. What can we do today to avert a global catastrophe with mass levels of death on our hands? Now, the good news is that we have the know-how, and we know how to get there. And the good news is when a child is severely wasted or malnourished, within 6 weeks, a time of 6 weeks, that can be reversed. But what is lacking now is a political will and funding. We have asked, but I will leave that to our Q&A. We do have the solutions, and we do have ideas on how to progress that. But Matt, I will stop here and hand back over to you, and we can later talk about the solutions.
Thanks, Nadine. That's been a really helpful introduction to the multiple factors that are driving this. And next we have Kirsty Robertson. Kirsty is the CEO of Caritas Australia. And just for those who don't know, Micah is a coalition of Australia's Christian international development aid agencies. There's 14 that support the work of Micah. And we have a number of CEOs that are women in our sector and in our coalition, which is wonderful. Several of them are on this call and will be joining us in Canberra. But Kirsty has recently returned from Ethiopia and seen some of the impacts of this global food crisis in person. And so we've asked her to bring some of her stories from that region to us today. So Kirsty, I'll pass to you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Matt. And thanks. I was just watching some of you eat your lunch there and wishing that I had some food in front of me. So I apologize if my stomach grumbles as we go through this. But I was just listening to Nadine and the facts that she was talking about. And I think the fact is that this is a very hard truth, and some of these numbers are very big. But what's really important, I think, for us, and really important for us in how we convey this to MPs and the Australian public more broadly, is that behind all of those numbers are people. And so I certainly, and you can hear from those statistics that there's this human suffering that's taking place across the Horn of Africa, across Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, that we haven't seen in decades. And I know this because I quite literally just came back from seeing it with my own eyes. And so today, rather than talk about more facts, what I wanted to talk to you about is some of the people that I met, so that you have in your mind stories that are behind these devastating statistics. So about 4 or 5 weeks ago now, I was in a village in Ethiopia, very far from the road. I was about 18 kilometres away from a dirt road, down a dry, bumpy river bed, a world and it seems at times a lifetime away from where I am today. And I was sitting on the skin of a goat that had become a mat essentially. And I was sitting in the shade of this woman's hut. Her name is Marley. And we were talking, and in a way we connected, I guess. She was about the same age as me. She wasn't sure how old she was, but I think she was her and I were of similar age. And as I reflect now on the encounter, the main thing that I remember is that there was, not in this picture, but a goat that kept nudging me, a single goat. And at first I thought it was nudging me. Sorry, we just might go back to the other slide. At first I think it was nudging me because it was because I was sitting on a goat skin. So I was thinking maybe it makes it feel a bit disquiet. But in the end, I think it was nudging me because I was sitting in the shade, the only piece of shade that was really around. But if you think a woman like Marley, who was a pastoralist, normally she would have had 20 or 30 goats. And this goat was the final goat that she and the family had. This was now their 5th consecutive dry season. And one by one, she had to kill off those goats. She had to kill them off because she didn't have food to feed them with. And she had to kill them off because she didn't have food for herself and her family. And so I think of her a lot now because that was quite literally the last piece of food that her family had available for her. She later took me into her hut, and we'll move on to the next slide where you can see a photo of her inside this hut. When I'd spoken to her, she was just returned from collecting water. As most of you are aware, collecting water is always women's work in these sorts of environments. And she had returned carrying this massive 20-litre jerry can, the yellow one that you see in that photo. She had left the night before at sundown, and she had just returned, and this was in the afternoon. So that journey had taken her over 18 hours to collect water. So what had been happening over the previous months is she started walking an hour to collect water. Then she had to walk 4. And then slowly but surely, as the river dries up, she's working further and further until now it's an overnight travel for her. Around her neck was a lock. A key, and she was really proud of the key. And when I asked her what it was for, it was a lock that she had on her hut, so she could lock her children inside so that they would be safe during that 18-hour journey. And she said that she felt really grateful for that because many others in the village didn't have that. And so they didn't have the security of knowing that their kids would be okay while they were gone. So I think in this hut, 4 by 4 meters or thereabouts, she sleeps with her 8 children. And she tried to teach me to grind maize. That's what she's doing there on that giant piece of stone. And I was literally terrible at it, like really bad. Nothing happened. Like it was still kernels of grain of maize when I finished. And she had a good old giggle. She laughed and said that it was lucky that I only had 1 child because I wouldn't be able to feed anymore because I was so slow at grinding the maize. But I think in the midst of that, I think we had a real moment of realizing that in the midst of all of this, she still had strength. You know, she still had things that made me realize not only is there goodness in her, but, you know, there is a real strength in her, fortitude. She's just walked 18 hours to get water, and now she's going to grind maize for the next few hours. We might just move on to the next photo. So I think Marley's story is not different from many of the other women that I met during my trip. Time and time again, these women told me of exactly the same story of hunger and really of this years of relentless drought. You know, essentially their resilience has been slowly eroded away year after year with dwindling resources, dying and dead livestock, no rain and no food. It really has been the first time, and I've been working in this space about 25 years now, and it really was the first time and the first trip I've made where I would really say that these communities that we were visiting were really finding themselves beyond hope. They were really struggling to imagine what their life could be, how their life could be any different. And I think it does come back to that year-on-year challenge that they had been facing. In the IDP camps up in the north, where they've travelled, they're all recounting these long journeys to walk day and night, carrying and cajoling their little small children, keeping moving in search of refuge. And they come to these big internally displaced camps. And in the camps themselves, they're really lucky. You know, in the camps themselves, they're finding themselves in a situation where they do have access, thanks to the wider international community, to clean water, to toilets, and to at least some food. Not necessarily enough food, but at least some food. Interestingly, I think many of the women that we spoke to were saying it wasn't the lack of water on the journey to get into these camps that you see in the picture there, or it wasn't, they're not worried particularly about the waterborne diseases or the thirst or the hunger. The main thing they were worried was if they would stop walking, that the armed men would come and take their daughters away from them. And time again, that is what the fear was of the women that are moving throughout Ethiopia at the moment, that they just didn't feel safe, and so that they had to try and get into these internally displaced camps. So, you know, as I reflect here and I look at your faces as I'm talking, I think, you know, we go about our daily lives and we know that there is injustice, and we try and do something about it. But I've got to say, when you're standing eye to eye with these communities that just quite simply do not have enough food to live, I think it's really then that I had this moment of realising what solidarity really means, and what a challenge it is to carry the story, the truth of these people back here in Australia, to try and get change. I would say in the midst of all of this pain and suffering, there were these beautiful tiny little beacons of light. There were, you know, some seeds, water in trucks, toilets, tarps. But really, I think the most that I saw that was these rays of light was just the generosity of the people that I met. Time and time again, I was welcomed into their little space to share a cup of coffee, or to share a piece of injera, which is the local food up there. Time and time again, I was, I guess, reminded of what is a very Catholic tradition of hospitality as a sacred duty. And I was really reminded, because that was part of their lived experience of every single moment of their day. And literally everyone I met wanted to share something with me, despite how little that they had. I wrote a blog, and in that blog I spoke about this idea of extravagant welcome, and I really do think that's what I experienced during this time here, and a real reminder of the beauty of these communities, and a real reminder of how much we have to learn from them. And I certainly left thinking, how can we be in a space of greater generosity here in Australia? How can we be in a space of constant reciprocity? Because that's the sort of qualities that we see in these communities that are suffering so much. And so I think, just to finish, the main thing that I hope that I can convey is perhaps to end on the story of, in one of the communities I was given this, and we might just stop the slides for a minute and then you can come back so I can actually show you what I'm holding. I'm hoping that you can see it actually. It's probably blurred because of my face, I've just realised. But, oh, Matt, I'm looking at you. I'm not sure if other people are also looking at you. But I was given this small seat that was provided by a community, and it was a gift that when we were leaving, and the man who's the chief of the village handed it over. You can see he said, "This is the most valuable thing I own. It's a seat where I rest when I'm looking after my goats. It's a pillow at night that's not necessarily comfortable, but that's a good thing because it wakes me up and I can go check on my livestock. It is quite literally the only thing that I own, and I give it to you. And I give it to you in the hope that you will tell my story to people back in Australia, and that they will know the suffering that our communities are experiencing, and that they will go speak my truth to the power in those communities. And so I tell you that story knowing that you now carry that man's story, and you carry the weight of some of the things that I saw. And I truly hope that, you know, when you go down to Canberra and in your local communities, that you can share a little bit about the experience of people in Ethiopia and beyond right now, because we really do need to get action. So thank you.
Thanks, Kirsty. That was incredibly powerful and helps drive it home. We can hear 49, 50 million people are on the brink of famine, but we actually need to understand the stories to really have that empathy that's required. So just to honour everyone's time, because we said that we would just give a 30-minute session for you. You're all very busy and you have other things to move on with. The delegates who are going to Canberra are going to stay on the line. It doesn't look like we have got that time for questions and answers. You can certainly email us any really key questions that you have if you have to step out at 1 o'clock. But I thought it might just be best to run through how Mike is responding and how you can take up that mantle that Kirsty has passed on and be an advocate for this issue and these stories that we've been hearing. So Carly, if you just go to the slides on our campaign. So in response to this issue, Micah Australia has started the Help Fight Famine campaign. And it's a campaign that we envisage taking hold in the church, but also going far beyond that into wider community groups, the wider humanitarian sector. But in your churches, you have the opportunity to basically share about this situation in your church and to help your congregations take action by writing to their local federal members. And that's so critical. I think you all understand the impression it would make on a federal politician not to receive, just one email, but to receive a stack of letters or a stack of emails from a local church in their local electorate who's engaged deeply with this issue and wants to reach out to them. So we have that church's toolkit and we're going to send it out to you in an email after. It's also on our fightfamine.com.au website. But as part of the Women Leaders Network, we want to support you. So if you want to take additional steps, please email Carly and myself and we can help you make those contacts with your federal member and set up meetings in your own electorate as well. And then if you could just go to the next slide, Carly. And just something that might appeal to some of you, but maybe not to others. We have an online day of action next Monday where we're just seeking to raise a bit more visibility on the issue. And you can print out a poster of yourself, a poster for yourself with the Help Fight Famine signage, or you can use a digital sticker if you're on Instagram and Facebook and place something in your stories. And again, it's just to raise the visibility of the issue. And just finally, in terms of what we're asking for and what these solutions are that we're calling on the Australian government for, really it's twofold. The first is a $150 million famine prevention package. And that's really about addressing immediate needs. And that kind of reflects a fair share investment that Australia can make with the global community right now to alleviate the worst suffering. And do you know what? It sounds like a lot and it's a constrained budget environment in Australia, but governments are capable of doing that. It's not that much in the scheme of things, $150 million. And so we're calling for that with the federal government. The other thing as well is talking about what Australia can do along with other nations to make sure we don't keep facing famine, that we actually have food security strategies so that when we face things like the rising impacts of climate change or of the mobility of populations across different countries and areas and displacement, that we don't end up in famine situations every 5 or 10 years. And that rate could increase with some of the factors that we're seeing. So they're the two asks that we're looking at. And on our website, there's a budget discussion paper which articulates for a political audience, for MPs, what we're calling for and why and how they can take action. And when we go to Canberra or when you use these resources in your churches, all of that information is there so that you can make the case to your federal MPs too. So I'm going to close our time for this first part of the briefing And we're just really grateful for all of you from the wider Women Leaders Network who are able to join us today. And like you said, we just love to support you in your advocacy, so please do reach out. But thanks so much for joining us here today.